Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to react to the shortlist for the Booker Prize 2023. They announced the 6 titles that are shortlisted just moments ago as I am filming this. There were definitely some surprises. I think I only actually got 2 books correct in my loose predictions that I did in my Friday reads last week, and I knew it was going to be difficult, but there are definitely some surprises on this. So let's just talk about what the shortlist is first, and then let's talk about some of the surprises, and then we'll spend a little more time with the shortlist. So the books that made it onto the shortlist for the Booker Prize 2023 are Study for Obedience by Sarah Bernstein, If I Survive You by Jonathan Escoffery, This Other Eden by Paul Harding, Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, Western Lane by Chetna Maroo, and The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. There are 3 Pauls on the shortlist. Doesn't really mean anything, it's just interesting. The books that we say goodbye to from the long list are The House of Doors by Twan, In Ascension by Martin MacInnes, All the Little Bird Hearts by Viktoria Lloyd-Barlow, Pearl by Sean Hughes, How to Build a Boat by Elaine Feeney, Old God's Time by Sebastian Barry, and A Spell of Good Things by bámi Adébáyọ. The first thing I'll say, just the announcement in general, when it started, it seemed like they were having audio problems. Maybe that was just something on my end, but I could barely hear Essie Adujin, who is the chair of the judges for this year, as she began her comments. They did sort of fix it. Live events that live stream are very difficult, and I wouldn't want to be in charge of them, so it's hard to be critical of them. But I had to turn the volume almost all the way up in order to hear her at all. So thankfully they managed to fix it just in time for her to start talking about the shortlist and what made it onto the list. Let's talk about the big surprise is here first. I think it seems like a huge surprise that Sebastian Barry didn't make the shortlist. I even said at one point that it almost felt like the long list was a way of stacking the deck for Sebastian Barry. And Twan also didn't make it. Twan had been in the mix for Booker with his 2 previous books, and those felt like the heaviest hitters on this list. It feels like this is something that's intentional. All 6 books that made it onto the shortlist are authors who have not been shortlisted before. Paul Murray was previously on the long list for The Bee Sting. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. I don't think anybody else has been in the mix before, but Paul Murray was definitely on the long list before. But so the shortlist includes people who are really on the shortlist for the first time. And that feels like a deliberate decision, and it kind of calls back to the surprise when the long list was announced, when there were not titles from big established authors like Barbara Kingsolver, Eleanor Catton, Zadie Smith, Salman Rushdie. It feels like the jury for this year is really looking for authors who have not been here before, or at least not at this level before, because again, Paul Murray was on a long list before, and Paul Harding has won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. So by nature, you can't call him an unestablished author. It just feels like they are trying to break new ground, because it starts to feel really intentional when you create an entire shortlist that is people who have not been here before. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It just feels, or at least it adds to this air that there's a bit of gamesmanship isn't the right word, but I'm reacting in the moment and I can't think of a better word. There's strategy involved in this, and it makes it a really interesting process, and it can make it really frustrating as well. And I have to say, I don't think this is a particularly interesting shortlist. There are really not any books that I would jump out and read immediately. I think we'll run through the titles a little bit more closely in a moment, but I think the only book that I am interested in right now is Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, which I don't believe is released in the United States yet. Of course, it would be easy enough to order a copy from the UK, the way the world is now. But that's the only one that, from the feedback of people who actually did go through and read the long list, it's the only one that I would say I would be interested in reading, but I wouldn't go to the lengths to make it happen right now, if that makes sense. Like, I'm not at a point where I'm like, ooh, I really have to read that book. Western Lane does sound interesting, but the reactions to it from people who read through the long list were pretty mixed. There were some people who liked it, but it almost feels surprising that it's on the shortlist, because people who were reading through definitely had some problems or issues with the book. And even people who liked it found some things to critique. And of course, because this is all objective, what you see as worth rewarding doesn't necessarily mean that it's not without flaw. A book can be really great or do really great things and still have flaws, but it adds to the sense that this is a sort of underwhelming list. So the only book on the short list that I have read is This Other Eden by Paul Harding, which I obviously have a copy of. Actually, that's not true. I have also read I Will Survive You by Jonathan Escoffery, and the fact that I forgot about it probably tells you my overall opinion of that book. Not to be overly negative, but I just really thought it was an interesting book that was pretty deeply flawed, and I couldn't get past the flaws in it. I think other people who have been reading through the long list have had better luck with I Will Survive You than I did. But to me, it's not a book I would have put on a long list. It's not a book I would have put on a short list. But the judges clearly don't agree with me. That's fine. I think there have been some people who I've only watched a handful of other people who have been reviewing the whole long list. I am not a person who would ever commit to reading an entire long list. I think one of the things I like about the Pulitzer is you don't have this sense of buildup where you have a long list of books that they create anticipation for and then they narrow it down. And I would never want to read a whole long list. I don't think it's possible. Maybe someday, but I would rather pick and choose my way through. And I think part of what I like about the Pulitzer is that they say, okay, here's the winner. And then there were 2 finalists. You're only finding out about them right now, but here you go. Everything's already finished and you already have a winner. So I feel like I like that a little bit more, but I definitely understand the benefits of doing a book prize like this. So anyway, This Other Eden, again, this is a book that I like and respect, and which I didn't really love. I could see myself putting it on a long list or on a short list, but I don't think I would have it win. Definitely people who worked their way through the long list have had a harder time with this. There are a lot of people who didn't like it. This seems to be a bit of a cilantro book. I'll be surprised if it wins. It would be a landmark if it does, because no one has won a Pulitzer Prize and a Booker. I think it will be very difficult for someone to win a Pulitzer and a Booker for the same book. It could potentially happen someday. I think it would be really difficult. So the best we can hope for right now is someone who has previously won a Pulitzer or a Booker winning the other prize that they need, kind of like an EGOT. And Paul Harding has a Pulitzer. The fact that he's made it onto the short list means that there is still a possibility that he could be the first to achieve this milestone. I'm really excited for that to happen. And for that reason, part of me is hoping This Other Eden will win, but I just, if it happens, I really don't think people will be happy at all. The book that I was most interested in reading off of the long list and hadn't gotten to yet was actually Old God's Time by Sebastian Barry. I know there really hasn't been a book that people have coalesced behind and been really excited about. There has been a fair amount of praise and a fair amount of criticism for pretty much every book that was on the long list, from what I've seen, at least. And therefore, there are definitely opposing viewpoints on Old God's Time, but the way people have talked about the book and reacted to it really got me interested. It was something that sounded interesting when the Longlist was announced, to me at least. And the way people have talked about it has really made me feel like, oh yeah, that is a book that I would like to read myself. And it didn't make the list. And again, it sort of feels like this is a case where the jury almost deliberately made a decision to focus on newer authors, newer discoveries. And again, you can't call Paul Murray or Paul Harding new discoveries, but they haven't been on the shortlist before. So it feels like there was an effort made to break new ground in that regard. And Twan and Sebastian Barry definitely paid the price for that. But I'm still hoping to read Sebastian Barry's book at some point. And it's a shame that the one book I felt a little bit excited to read didn't make the shortlist. And again, I didn't feel very into If I Survive You by Jonathan Escoffery. It's a book that at the time I did a Friday Reads on it. I'll try to track down the Friday Reads and I'll link it down below. I felt like I was complaining a lot about a book that I had liked. Sometimes that happens. Over time, the criticisms and complaints that I had about that book sort of festered and became malignant, and to the point where it just became a book that when it comes up, I just think, oh, I didn't really like that. And at the time I read it, I'd be like, oh, it's good. I have some critiques, but it's good. And, I think it is ambitious. I don't think the execution really worked very well at all. But again, clearly the jury does not agree with me. Let's run through the books that made the shortlist really quickly in case you have not really paid attention to the books that were on the long list and this is sort of your first experience of them. By the way, when they were doing the announcement, it became very obvious very quickly that they were announcing them alphabetically by author, which meant that it was really easy to suss out the snubs or surprises before they got to the end of the list. Like when you open with Sarah Bernstein and then the next person on the list is Jonathan Escoffery and then the next person is Paul Harding. It's like, oh, they're doing this alphabetically. Ooh, Sebastian Barry didn't make it. Twan didn't make it. And when the last person the second to last person is Western Lane by Chetna Maroo, it's pretty obvious, well, the only person left that it could be is Paul Murray. So usually they mix it up a little bit when they announce something, but it made the list feel predictable as they were announcing it, because you could sort of look at the alphabet and say, all right, well, this person's out of the running. And it was just an interesting way of making the announcement. It doesn't damage it, really, but again, when you're 3 books in and you've confirmed, okay, they're announcing them alphabetically, well, Sebastian Barry's gone. It's just an interesting experience. So anyway, we're starting with Study for Obedience by Sarah Bernstein. In this book, Sarah Bernstein explores themes of prejudice, abuse, and guilt through the eyes of a singularly unreliable narrator. From the videos that I have watched of people who have been reading their way through the long list, unreliable narrators seems to be something of a mini trend among the Booker books for 2023. Old God's Time was another example, but obviously that didn't make the shortlist. But it does seem to be something that popped up a lot in reviews of the books that I was watching. Anyway, here's the description of the book. A woman moves from the place of her birth to a remote northern country to be housekeeper to her brother, whose wife has just left him. Soon after she arrives, a series of unfortunate events occurs. Collective bovine hysteria, the death of a ewe and her nearly born lamb, a local dog's phantom pregnancy, a potato blight. She notices that the community's suspicion about incomers in general seems to be directed particularly in her case. She feels their hostility growing, pressing at the edges of her brother's property. Inside the house, although she tends to her brother and his home with the utmost care and attention, he too begins to fall ill. I confess, I still don't feel entirely interested in reading this book, but there have been some recent videos that I've seen from people who were reading their way through the long list and got to this one toward the end. And the way they talked about it did make me start to wonder, that sounds like stuff that could be considered like urgent or timely, and talking about outsiders, hostility at the edges, suspicion about incomers, definitely a topic of concern for Europe, also for the United States. And people have also mentioned that the woman at the center of the novel is Jewish, so it brings in that angle as well. And I had already done my predictions. Had I known all of that context or heard these videos from people who were reading their way through the long list, I might have given it a spot on my prediction list, because as soon as I heard those, I thought, that sounds like something that could make the shortlist. But it all came a little late. That's fine. It does sound interesting. I could end up changing my mind about this book once, the winner is announced, if people really dive in and do more reading of these books. I think most people who are committed to it have already done it with the long list. But there's potential that I could change my mind about this. I just don't feel any urgent need to read it, if that makes sense. So for now, it's just going to be something I've heard other people talk about online. Then we have If I Survive You by Jonathan Escoffery, and this is the one again. I like what it's doing. I didn't think it did it successfully. Here's what they say. An exhilarating novel in stories that pulses with style, heart, and barbed humor while unraveling what it means to carve out an existence between cultures, homes, and paychecks. And there has been some controversy about this book, because I believe story collections are not supposed to be eligible, but this flirts with being a story collection, so that has had some people, speculating or wondering how much it actually qualifies. In 1979, as political violence consumes their native Kingston, Tapper and Sonia flee to Miami, but they soon learn that the welcome in America will be far from warm. Trelawney, their youngest son, comes of age in a society that regards him with suspicion and confusion. Their eldest son, Delano's longing for a better future for his own children is equaled only by his recklessness in trying to secure it. As both brothers navigate the obstacles littered in their path, an unreliable father, racism, a financial crisis, and Hurricane Andrew, they find themselves pitted against one another. Will their rivalry be the thing that finally tears their family apart? Climate crisis is another thing that people have sort of picked up on as they were reading their way through. It comes up in this book with Hurricane Andrew, although when you read it, it covers other topics much more heavily, like climate crisis would be kind of down the list. And that's also something I've heard about the bee sting. It is concerned with climate crisis, but there are many other things going on that are a little more prevalent in the book. So again, I didn't really enjoy If I Survive You. Clearly, the jury disagrees. We'll see what happens with this. Then we get to This Other Eden by Paul Harding. And what they say is, full of lyricism and power, Paul Harding's spellbinding novel celebrates the hopes, dreams, and resilience of those deemed not to fit in a world brutally intolerant of difference. Inspired by historical events, This Other Eden tells the story of Apple Island, an enclave off the coast of the United States where castaways, in flight from society and its judgment, have landed and built a home. In 1972, formerly enslaved Benjamin Honey arrives on the in 1792, I inverted the numbers. In 1792, formerly enslaved Benjamin Honey arrives on the island with his Irish wife, Patience, to make a life together there. More than a century later, the Honey's descendants remain, alongside an eccentric, diverse band of neighbors. Then comes the intrusion of civilization. Officials determined to cleanse the island. A missionary schoolteacher selects one light-skinned boy to save. The rest will succumb to the authorities' institutions or cast themselves on the waters in a new Noah's Ark. Again, this is one that I had read. I had already planned to read it when the Booker Longlist was announced, so I kind of did that. Paul Harding is an author who was on my Pulitzer Prize project because he won for his debut novel, which is Tinkers. I will include a link to the Friday Reads where I discussed this book down below. I will also include my video about my deep dive on Tinkers because I had just wanted to do that deep dive once he sort of got in the mix for the Booker, because one, he has a new book out, or had a new book out, and just the fact that he's in the mix made me think this is a good time to do a deep dive. So that will be down below as well. I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about this one. Again, definitely seems like a cilantro book on the long list. I think if it wins, a lot of people are going to be unhappy. And Not that the purpose of a book prize is to keep a lot of people happy, but it's going to be interesting to see what happens if it does end up winning. The next shortlisted book is Prophet Song by Paul Lynch. A mother faces a terrible choice in Paul Lynch's exhilarating, propulsive, and confrontational portrait of a society on the brink. On a dark, wet evening in Dublin, scientist and mother of four, Eilish Stack, answers her front door to find the GNSB on her doorstep. Two officers from Ireland's newly formed secret police want to speak with her husband. Things are falling apart. Ireland is in the grip of a government that is taking a turn toward tyranny, and as the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, Eilish finds herself caught within the nightmare logic of a collapsing society, assailed by unpredictable forces beyond her control and forced to do whatever it takes to keep her family together. This is a book that people have been enjoying, but there are also people who have not really responded to it, and I think part of that is that it's not really about the Troubles, but it kind of is, and I think there's a sense, it's a sort of unspoken sense, and people aren't really saying this, but, sorry, my laptop is running low on battery, so I'm just plugging it in. I feel like people are a little burned out on that, especially since Milkman by Anna Burns covered that topic and won a few years ago, so I wonder if there's a bit of burnout on the topic. It does seem like this approaches it in a slightly different way. What might help this book is the fact that it's also very much about the slow encroachment of tyranny or into your life, and it's also about complacency. These are topics that are very much on my mind in the United States, and I think they're very much on the mind of people in the UK as well, because you have these political elements that you don't agree with and that are pretty terrible, but you kind of go along to get along, and it's very timely. So maybe it will get around that sense of the familiar through the fact that it also deals with this sense of urgency people have about politics right now. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with this book. I think I think you could say The Bee Sting is probably the book that most people have coalesced behind and become fans of, but Prophet Song might be the second place book in that realm, at least again from the videos that I have seen of people reading their way through the long list. Then we have Western Lane by Chetna Maroo, one of the books that, again, of the themes that people have found, there are a lot about a missing parent, and this and Pearl are probably, well, also How to Build a Boat. A lot of them deal with missing parents, but this is one of the foremost ones of those. Chetna Maroo's tender and moving debut novel about grief, sisterhood, a teenage girl's struggle to transcend herself, and squash. 11-year-old Gopi has been playing squash since she was old enough to hold a racket. When her mother dies, her father enlists her in a quietly brutal training regimen, and the game becomes her world. Slowly she grows apart from her sisters. Her life is reduced to the sport, guided by its rhythms, the serve, the volley, the drive, the shot, and its echo. But on the court, she is not alone. She is with her pa, she is with Ged, a 13-year-old boy with his own formidable talent. She is with the players who have come before her. She is in awe. And again, there are people who have really responded to the story about grief and sort of the absence of a parent, and then the struggle to know what to do with that grief, and there's sort of a missed connection between the father and the daughter as they work through their own grief in very different ways. And it's resonated with a fair amount of people, but it hasn't really quite landed with another fairly large amount of people. So again, it will be interesting to see what happens and what the fate of this book is on the list. That takes us to the final book on the shortlist, Paul Murray's The Bee Sting. A patch of ice on the road, a casual favor to a charming stranger, a bee caught beneath a bridal veil. Can a single moment of bad luck change the direction of a life? I will say, before we get into the full description, the ending of this book seems to be very divisive. There are people who are saying, like, I really liked this until it got to the ending. There are people who are saying, I really didn't like it, and then the ending saved it. And there are people who are saying, wow, that ending, in both directions. Like, I really hated it. I don't know what happens, but it seems very divisive. Dickie's once lucrative car business is going under, but rather than face the music, he's spending his days in the woods, building an apocalypse-proof bunker. His exasperated wife, Imelda, is selling off her jewelry on eBay while half-heartedly dodging the attentions of fast-talking cattle farmer, Big Mike. Meanwhile, teenage daughter Cass, formerly top of her class, seems determined to binge drink her way to her final exams, and 12-year-old PJ, in debt to local sociopath Ears Moran, is putting the final touches to his grand plan to run away. Yes, in Paul Murray's brilliant tragicomic saga, the Barnes family is definitely in trouble. So where did it all go wrong? And if this story has already been written, is there still time to find a happy ending? I think part of my resistance to this book in general is that I read Skippy Dies, which is the book that Paul Murray was previously longlisted for the Booker Prize for. And I did not get on with it. I think if it was a much shorter book, it could have potentially endeared itself to me and been successful. And I have heard that criticism of the bee sting. I have heard at least a couple of different people say this book really didn't need to be as long as it is. It is a really chunky book. And I've heard a fair amount of people say that it definitely could have been shorter. So that seems to be Paul Murray's thing. And because I had that experience in Skippy Dies, I fully believe that I would think the same thing if I read The Bee Sting. And I'm just not feeling like I want to subject myself to that. Especially since a lot of people, even people who like the book, do say that it's essentially a series of novellas about each character. And then the last part of the book breaks that formula. And from what has been said, it becomes very fragmented. And I don't know what happens in the book, but it definitely becomes fragmented, moves back and forth a lot. And actually, Jen Campbell had a lot of interesting things to say about The Bee Sting, because she was really interrogating, like, why is the book being written this way? So I'd recommend seeking that video out if you have not already. That's The Bee Sting. I don't feel compelled to read it just because I really didn't have a good experience of Skippy Dies. Everything I've heard about The Bee Sting so far makes me feel like that experience would just repeat if I did this again. Maybe if this book continues to have a run of good luck, maybe if it wins, I'll revisit, but it's not going to happen this year. I can almost guarantee you that. If my mind does change and I start to think, I'll try The Bee Sting, it would probably be well in the future. So not this year. And again, to me, this just feels like an underwhelming shortlist. And it felt like an underwhelming long list to me. That's part of why I'm never going to be someone who will commit to reading an entire long list. I mean, never say never. It could happen. But it would take a lot to get me to do it. And I just feel underwhelmed by Booker this year. It's my bitter Booker year. And it has been from the moment that Demon Copperhead did not make the long list. And I know there are a lot of people out there who are happy that Demon Copperhead didn't make the long list. They were not shy about telling me that. But to me, it's just, it's my bitter Booker year. It is what it is. And this doesn't compel me. This shortlist does not compel me to change my mind. It doesn't excite me. The only book on this list, I could be convinced to read Western Lane. That's not, I was going to say the only book on this list that I would feel interested in reading, since I've already read This Other Eden, is Prophet Song by Paul Lynch. And again, I'm not in a rush. It probably won't even happen this year, because I don't think it comes out until December in the United States. Again, it's my bitter Booker year, and the shortlist really didn't do anything to change that. I don't feel compelled to seek any of these books out. Maybe that'll change. I'd love to hear what you think about this shortlist. If you're feeling disappointed, it does seem that a fair amount of people there's a very mixed response to the Booker long list this year. And that does kind of make it an interesting Booker year in one way. But when there's such mixed response, it's hard to really work up enthusiasm for it as well. So I'd love to hear what you think of this shortlist, the long list in general. Are you also having a bitter Booker year? Let me know all of that in the comment section down below. We will see what happens. Let me pull up my little cheat sheet for book prizes. So the winner of the Booker Prize will be announced on November 26th. We have a ways to go before we get there. In the meantime, we will be getting the shortlist for the National Book Award on October 3rd. So that is coming up. Stay tuned. And the Nobel Prizes will be announced the week of October 5th. And I can't remember when I noted this down, if that is the date that they have slated for the literature winner, or if that's just the week that they're doing them. But Nobel Prizes are also going to be coming. So there's a lot still going on in the build-up to the Booker Prize announcement. Stay tuned for reactions to all of that. And again, let me know what you think in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.